The palace was silent, but inside, a storm was brewing. Imagine waking up one morning to find your most cherished title, your very identity as a prince, stripped away, handed over to a stranger, someone you barely know. That is exactly what happened to Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, a man who once walked the corridors of Buckingham Palace with pride and purpose, now facing a reality that would shake him to his core. King Charles, the monarch of the United Kingdom and head of the Commonwealth, had made a decision so shocking, so unprecedented, that it left the entire royal family reeling. And at the center of this whirlwind, Johnny Thompson, a name that until recently had barely whispered through palace halls, now elevated to the coveted title of Duke of Sussex, a title that Harry had called his own, one tied to legacy, honor, and history. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. How could this happen? How could the son of the late Princess Diana, a man who captured the public's imagination, the media's attention, and the hearts of millions, suddenly find himself erased from the very institution he was born to serve? This isn't a story about royal protocol, strictly speaking. This is about betrayal, power, secrecy, and the kind of family politics that would make even the most hardened observers gasp. And the answer, the full truth behind why Johnny Thompson was elevated and Harry was cut out, is far darker, more intricate, and more shocking than anyone could have imagined. To understand the gravity of this moment, you have to go back to the whispers that had been floating through palace corridors for months. Advisors murmured in hushed tones about Harry's increasingly strained relationship with his father, King Charles. Friends of the Sussexes noted a growing isolation, a sense that Harry was being systematically distanced from the institutions he once held dear. And yet, even those closest to him never suspected that the final blow would come in such a public, humiliating, and irreversible way. Can you imagine being told, in essence, you are no longer who you thought you were? Your title, your name, your legacy, it's gone, and someone else has it now? That was the reality Harry faced, and the palace records, insider testimonies, and leaked messages tell a story that is as fascinating as it is devastating. At the heart of the drama is Johnny Thompson. Who is he? How did he go from relative obscurity to being thrust into the limelight as the new Duke of Sussex? The answer is a web of intrigue, strategy, and carefully orchestrated moves behind closed palace doors. Some claim he was handpicked for loyalty, someone Charles could trust to uphold the values and image of the monarchy without question. Others whisper that Johnny's rise was a calculated move, a chess play designed to finally remove Harry from the line of influence and ensure the monarchy's narrative could continue without the shadow of scandal, rebellion, or unpredictable behavior looming over it. Imagine a chessboard, each piece moving with purpose, and suddenly, the knight you thought was on your side turns into the queen, claiming the position you believed was yours forever. That is exactly what happened here. And yet, even as the public was largely unaware of the intricate plotting behind the scenes, the consequences were immediate. The news broke like a shockwave. Headlines screamed of betrayal. Social media erupted with confusion, outrage, and endless speculation. Harry's supporters were stunned. How could a king, who had once praised his son and entrusted him with duties, simply erase him from the narrative? And how could the monarchy take a figure like Johnny Thompson and elevate him so suddenly, granting him a title loaded with history, expectation, and power? The optics alone were enough to make the world stop and stare, but the truth, the story that nobody could tell openly, was even more explosive. For Harry, the impact was not just symbolic, it was deeply personal. We are talking about a man whose identity is intertwined with the title of Duke of Sussex, a title that carries not only prestige, but also responsibility, memory, and connection to his late mother. Princess Diana's legacy looms over every aspect of Harry's life, and to have that title transferred to an outsider, it's not just a loss, it's a rupture of the very fabric of family, tradition, and personal history. One can only imagine the emotional turmoil, the private conversations filled with desperation, the sleepless nights wondering how this could possibly happen. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. This wasn't an impulsive decision. It was deliberate, calculated, and carefully timed to maximize its impact, not just on Harry, but on the public's perception of the royal family and the hierarchy within it. And now, let's step back for a moment. Why does this matter to you? You might be thinking, this is just royal drama. Why should I care? But the truth is, the story goes beyond titles and palace walls. It's a window into power, influence, loyalty, and the human cost of decisions made at the highest levels. It's about family betrayal that is both ancient and modern, political maneuvering that rivals the most gripping thriller, and the way public perception is manipulated with surgical precision. It's about watching someone fall from grace while someone else rises, seemingly from nowhere, to claim what was once untouchable. And most importantly, it's about the choices we make, the consequences of ambition, and the fragility of legacy. As we begin to peel back the layers of this story, you'll discover secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. Leaked messages, private conversations, and insider accounts reveal not only the mechanics of Johnny Thompson's rise, but also the inner workings of King Charles's strategy. There are moments of irony, moments of heartbreak, and moments so shocking that even seasoned royal commentators were left speechless. You will meet advisors whose names will soon become infamous in their own right, witnesses who risked everything to speak, and patterns of behavior that suggest a level of planning most people never imagined. Every decision, every whisper, every glance in the palace halls mattered, and all of it was building toward the moment when Harry's world would be irrevocably altered. And let's talk about the emotional layers here. Harry's exclusion is not just a professional slight. It's a familial and public humiliation. Imagine being cut out of the family narrative, your public role erased, your private grief compounded by global attention. How do you process that? How do you respond when the institution that was supposed to define your life suddenly shifts its focus elsewhere, elevates someone new, and leaves you to grapple with the consequences? And then, imagine seeing Johnny Thompson walking the halls, wearing the insignia, receiving the accolades, stepping into a role that once belonged to you. That mix of anger, disbelief, sorrow, and isolation is something few can truly understand, but it's what defines this story. At the same time, Johnny Thompson is no mere passive beneficiary. His journey is compelling, mysterious, and in many ways, deliberately concealed until the moment of revelation. Was he the perfect pawn, a brilliant opportunist, or something else entirely? The palace, the media, and the advisors have all contributed fragments of a puzzle that only now, piece by piece, is becoming clear. And as you follow this story, you will be forced to ask yourself, how much of this was strategy, how much was personal preference, and how much was simple timing, an alignment of circumstances that created a perfect storm? By now, you might be wondering, what about the king himself? What drove King Charles to make such a seismic decision? The answer lies at the intersection of history, duty, and personal conviction. Charles has been king for only a few years, yet every decision he makes is scrutinized, dissected, and debated. He knows the weight of precedent, the importance of optics, and the legacy he leaves behind. To elevate Johnny Thompson and cut Harry out is not just a familial choice. It is a statement. It is a declaration of priorities, an indication of who he trusts, and a message to the world about the direction of the monarchy. But what exactly prompted this action? Was it loyalty, fear, resentment, or something far more calculated? And this is where the story truly begins to twist, because the reasons behind the decision are as complex as the palace itself. So, what can we expect as we unravel the events leading up to this extraordinary moment? You will hear about secret meetings, whispers of betrayal, and the careful orchestration of public announcements. You will discover why Harry's allies were powerless, why the media narrative was so tightly controlled, and how Johnny Thompson's rise was timed to perfection. You'll witness the interplay of ambition, legacy, and family loyalty in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the royal family. And you will feel the human side of it all, the fear, the anxiety, the heartbreak, and yes, the exhilaration of watching history being made in real time. But this is just the beginning. What happened next, behind palace walls and away from public view, would set the stage for the ultimate confrontation. Harry's reactions, the advisors' maneuverings, and the public's response all intersected in a way that nobody could have predicted. Alliances shifted, secrets were revealed, and the monarchy itself faced questions about transparency, tradition, and power. And yet, even with all the chaos, one thing remained clear. Johnny Thompson was no longer a footnote. He was the Duke of Sussex, and Harry had been erased. The reverberations of this decision would be felt for years, perhaps generations, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. And just when you think you've grasped the full magnitude of this story, the palace whispers reveal a twist so shocking, so unexpected, that it would leave even the most seasoned observers reeling. Secrets that were buried for decades, alliances that nobody knew existed, and a betrayal that could rewrite history itself. All of it comes into focus as the drama escalates. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Imagine waking up one morning to a world that no longer recognizes you. Not just your title, not just your role, but your very place in the story you thought was yours. For Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, that world had arrived, unannounced and devastating. Just months ago, he was the second most famous royal in the world, adored by fans, courted by media outlets, and celebrated for his dedication to charity and service. But suddenly, the corridors of power that had once welcomed him became silent hallways of exclusion. The whispers began quietly, almost imperceptibly, insiders suggesting that Harry's influence was waning, that his father, King Charles, had begun to question his judgment, his loyalty, and even his place within the royal family. The fall did not happen overnight. It began with small slights, invitations withheld, official events subtly reshuffled, responsibilities shifted without explanation. Royal aides, once loyal to Harry, started receiving instructions directly from Charles's office, bypassing him entirely. The press, often a mirror of palace sentiment, began to report on a strained father-son relationship, painting Harry as distant, difficult, and increasingly isolated. But behind the headlines, the truth was far more calculated, far more personal. Every move, every decision, was part of a larger strategy, a quiet but relentless campaign to diminish Harry's authority and eventually, his claim to legacy itself. But why? Why would a father, a king, turn so deliberately against his own son? Was it a reaction to Harry's public choices, his decision to step back from royal duties, or something deeper, more insidious? Those closest to the palace say it was a combination, a mix of disappointment, frustration, and the kind of calculated caution only a monarch can wield. King Charles, after decades preparing for the throne, had learned the harsh truth about power. It must be managed carefully, and no position is guaranteed, even for one's own blood. And Harry, for all his charm, his popularity, and his genuine intentions, had become an unpredictable element, a wild card in the meticulously controlled world of Buckingham Palace. The first real signs of Harry's fall were subtle, almost innocuous, but sharp enough to cut. Invitations to certain charitable events started to arrive late or not at all. Requests for royal endorsements were quietly denied. His staff was slowly pared down, with loyal aides reassigned to other members of the family. Even Harry's favorite charities began receiving mixed messages, official approval withheld at crucial moments. Publicly, it looked like administrative reorganization. Privately, it was the beginning of a strategic sidelining. And yet, Harry's awareness of these moves did little to prepare him for what came next. The ultimate humiliation was not a public spat or a media leak. It was the realization that his place, his very identity as the Duke of Sussex, could be stripped away and handed to someone else. Not a distant cousin, not a veteran member of the royal household, but Johnny Thompson, a figure who, until recently, had barely registered on the palace radar. The announcement, when it came, was deliberate, precise, and devastating. It wasn't broadcast with fanfare or ceremony. Rather, it slipped through the carefully managed channels of palace communications, a small notice buried in official documents and quietly reported by select media outlets. But for Harry, the impact was immediate and crushing. This wasn't just about losing a title. The Duke of Sussex is more than a name. It carries history, weight, and connection to the very fabric of the monarchy. It is tied to the memory of Princess Diana, Harry's late mother, whose legacy shaped his identity and mission. Losing that title meant more than losing a position. It meant losing a piece of himself, a public affirmation of his role in the family, and the acknowledgement of the work and sacrifices he had made. And to have it given to a complete outsider, someone unknown, someone chosen over him, that cut deeper than any public critique ever could. Insiders reveal that the decision to elevate Johnny Thompson was discussed extensively within the palace long before it became public. Meetings, consultations, and strategy sessions took place behind closed doors, involving advisors, legal counsel, and even members of the extended royal family. Every angle was considered: the optics, the potential backlash, and the message it would send, not just to Harry, but to the public. The move was surgical in its execution, designed to minimize resistance and maximize shock. And it worked. Harry's circle was left scrambling, media commentators were stunned, and public opinion hung in suspense, unsure how to react. But there is more. The fall of a prince is never purely professional. For Harry, the emotional toll was profound. Friends report nights of private despair, long walks through London as he processed the reality of his situation, and endless phone calls with confidants trying to make sense of the unfolding events. He questioned his relationship with his father, his own decisions, and even his future in the public eye. The palace, once a symbol of security and prestige, had transformed into a stage for public humiliation, a battleground for power, and a reminder that in the monarchy, nothing is permanent, even for a prince. There were moments of visible frustration and emotional intensity. In one incident, a senior aide recounted, Harry received word that his schedule had been altered without consultation. He was due to attend a public engagement honoring military veterans, an event he had championed for years. Instead, his presence was quietly reassigned, with Johnny Thompson appearing in his stead. The message was clear: Harry's influence was being erased, and his duties were being reassigned to someone entirely new. That moment, small as it may seem to the public, was seismic in the private world of palace hierarchy. It was a signal that Harry's role was no longer his own, that the authority he had once wielded with confidence was now subject to the king's direct intervention. And yet, there was still a question burning in everyone's mind. Why Harry? He had been a loyal son, had carried the family name with distinction, and had endeared himself to the public in ways few royals ever achieve. But loyalty alone is not enough in a world where perception is power, and power must be carefully balanced. Harry had become too visible, too outspoken, and too unpredictable. His international engagements, interviews, and charitable initiatives, while noble, had also exposed cracks in the controlled image of the monarchy. From the perspective of King Charles and his inner circle, the risk outweighed the reward. And when it came time to make a choice, the decision was stark. Remove the element of uncertainty and place the title in the hands of someone deemed safer, more compliant, and entirely loyal. This is where the public narrative diverged from the private reality. To the media, the move might have seemed abrupt or arbitrary. To the palace, it was calculated. Every ripple, every reaction was anticipated. Every potential challenge, every loyalist voice was assessed. And yet, even the most meticulous planning could not prepare anyone for the raw emotional impact on Harry himself. He had been stripped of more than a title. He had been stripped of certainty, control, and the symbolic markers of his identity. So, where does that leave him? Alienated from the very institution he once represented, distanced from the family he loved, and facing a world that now sees Johnny Thompson as the Duke of Sussex, Harry is navigating uncharted waters. His fall is not just a personal story. It's a public lesson in power, loyalty, and the consequences of being caught in a tide that moves faster than anyone can anticipate. For the rest of the royal family, it is a warning. No title, no privilege, no legacy is immune to strategic intervention. For the public, it is a glimpse into a world where appearances are carefully managed, and where the line between family and institution is blurred beyond recognition. And yet, even in the midst of this fall, one question lingers, unspoken but urgent. How far would King Charles go to ensure the monarchy's stability, even if it meant severing the bond with his own son? The answer, as the events that follow will reveal, is farther than anyone could have imagined. And while Harry's story is one of sudden erasure and personal heartbreak, it also sets the stage for the rise of Johnny Thompson, a man who would inherit a title, a legacy, and a world that once belonged to another. But what came next would change everything. and no one saw it coming. Who is Johnny Thompson, and why is he suddenly at the center of one of the most explosive royal dramas in decades? Until recently, few outside palace circles had even heard the name. Johnny was not a prince, not a public figure, not someone groomed for royal duties from birth. Yet, in a move that stunned the world, King Charles elevated him to the Duke of Sussex, Harry's very own title, and placed him firmly in the spotlight. The sheer audacity of this decision sent ripples across the monarchy, leaving insiders and the public alike scrambling for answers. How does a relatively unknown figure ascend to such a position, seemingly overnight? And what does this mean for the monarchy and for Harry himself? To understand Johnny Thompson, you have to understand the palace chessboard. Every figure in the royal household serves a purpose, often more symbolic than functional. Advisors, aides, and even distant relatives move quietly behind the scenes, influencing decisions in ways the public cannot see. Johnny Thompson, according to multiple insiders, was once a peripheral figure in this complex web, known to a handful of key advisors, respected for his discretion, intelligence, and loyalty, but not considered a contender for anything as prestigious as a ducal title. Yet, in the shadows, he was quietly building relationships, making himself indispensable in ways most observers could not detect. Think of him as a ghost player in a game of kings, unseen but moving strategically, preparing for a moment that, until it arrived, nobody else expected. Johnny's background is, in many ways, as unremarkable as it is compelling. Sources indicate he grew up outside of the public eye, in a relatively modest environment compared to the gilded halls of the palace. He had no aristocratic pedigree, no claim to royal blood, no inherited influence. Yet, he possessed an uncanny ability to navigate elite circles, demonstrating a combination of charm, intellect, and adaptability that made him a favorite among advisors who valued competence over heritage. There are whispers of internships and brief roles in charitable organizations, some connected to the royal family, where Johnny proved himself meticulous, strategic, and discreet. In these early years, no one could have predicted that this quiet man would one day hold one of the most coveted titles in the monarchy. So how did he get noticed? According to palace insiders, Johnny first caught the attention of senior advisors during a critical period of planning for international charitable initiatives. He demonstrated an aptitude for diplomacy, media handling, and crisis management, skills that, in the insular world of royalty, are gold. Advisors described him as a problem solver who could execute sensitive assignments with precision and discretion. This combination of capability and loyalty, coupled with his relative obscurity, made him an ideal candidate for roles that required absolute trust. In other words, he was the perfect storm: competent, reliable, invisible, and entirely controllable. But being competent alone would not have been enough to elevate him to the Duke of Sussex. The palace is full of talented individuals, yet very few achieve positions of prominence without a combination of timing, opportunity, and political alignment. For Johnny, that alignment came in the form of King Charles's growing concern over Harry's increasingly unpredictable behavior. The king and his advisors had grown wary of the former Duke of Sussex, whose international engagements, outspoken interviews, and media visibility were no longer easily managed. Harry had become, in their eyes, a liability, a wild card whose popularity could not shield him from scrutiny or the consequences of perceived missteps. Enter Johnny Thompson, the man who could stabilize, control, and deliver a consistent image for the monarchy. According to sources, Charles's team began to see him as the ideal replacement, someone who could inherit the Duke of Sussex title without controversy, embarrassment, or resistance. He was loyal to the crown, adept at navigating sensitive situations, and, perhaps most importantly, untainted by the history, scandal, or personality that had come to define Harry in the eyes of the palace. By all accounts, Johnny's rise was both deliberate and strategic, orchestrated long before Harry even suspected a threat. It's important to note that Johnny Thompson's public persona is carefully crafted. Unlike Harry, whose every move is dissected and broadcast globally, Johnny maintains a level of discretion that is unusual in modern royal circles. He rarely speaks to the press, avoids social media, and presents himself as a steady, dependable figure. Some observers have likened him to a shadow monarch, quietly shaping influence without seeking attention. This ability to operate below the radar made him not only acceptable to the palace, but, in many ways, ideal. In a world where perception is everything, his invisibility became his greatest asset. And yet, Johnny is not simply a passive figure. Behind his calm, composed exterior lies a man who understands power, loyalty, and the stakes involved in stepping into a role previously held by a prince. Insiders hint at private consultations, strategic advice given to the king, and a deep understanding of palace dynamics that few outsiders possess. Some even suggest that Johnny recognized the opportunity early on and positioned himself subtly, ensuring he would be the obvious choice when Charles made his move. Think of it as an invisible ladder to power, built one careful rung at a time, until the moment arrived for him to step into the spotlight. What makes Johnny Thompson's rise even more fascinating is the contrast with Harry. One man, born into privilege, known worldwide, celebrated for charity work and personal courage, now sees his title transferred to a man who had worked quietly behind the scenes. The emotional, psychological, and symbolic weight of this transition is enormous. For Harry, the comparison is unavoidable. For the public, the optics are stunning. A beloved royal erased, replaced by a figure whose rise seems, at first glance, almost magical. But make no mistake, this was neither chance nor happenstance. Every detail, every timing decision, and every internal maneuver was deliberate. Even those closest to Johnny admit that he is not without ambition. While loyalty to the crown is paramount, insiders suggest he understands the magnitude of what he has been given. To step into a role like Duke of Sussex is to inherit not only a title, but also the weight of expectations, history, and public scrutiny. Unlike Harry, whose fame often overshadowed responsibilities, Johnny must navigate a delicate balance between visibility and discretion. He is, in many ways, a study in contrast, public enough to fulfill ceremonial duties, yet private enough to avoid the pitfalls that have plagued Harry. But the mystery deepens when you consider the whispers about Johnny's personal connections. Some sources allege that he has cultivated relationships with key advisors, both within the palace and beyond, that positioned him as the obvious choice for this elevation. Others suggest he has quietly built influence through philanthropic work, charitable boards, and diplomatic channels, earning trust that most outsiders could only dream of. It is a combination of skill, timing, and perception management, a trifecta that few in royal history have mastered. What is clear is that Johnny Thompson's ascent was not accidental. It was calculated, deliberate, and executed with a precision that only insiders can fully appreciate. And the consequences for Harry, as we have already begun to see, are profound. Not only has he lost a title, but he has been forced to confront the reality that his position in the family is no longer guaranteed. For someone whose identity and legacy are deeply entwined with his role as Duke of Sussex, this is a seismic, life-altering event. And yet, there is one question that remains. How did Johnny feel when he learned he would inherit Harry's title? Was it excitement, nervousness, or something else entirely? The answer, according to palace insiders, is complicated. Publicly, Johnny maintains a composed, measured demeanor, as if he were born for this role. Privately, however, it is said he is aware of the magnitude of what has been entrusted to him, understanding both the opportunities and the scrutiny that accompany it. And, perhaps more surprisingly, he also recognizes the tension this decision has created within the royal family, particularly with Harry, who has been effectively erased from the equation. This tension, of course, is what makes the story so compelling. You have two men, both tied to the same title in different ways, one by birth, one by elevation. One represents legacy, rebellion, and public admiration. The other represents loyalty, discretion, and strategic positioning. The collision of these two forces, set against the backdrop of a monarchy that has always valued stability above all else, creates a narrative that is equal parts drama, intrigue, and emotional intensity. As we continue, the next layer of the story reveals just how the palace orchestrated this elevation. Secret meetings, careful timing, and strategic leaks all played a role in preparing the public, the advisors, and even Harry himself for what was coming. And it wasn't just about replacing one man with another. It was about sending a message to the world, to the family, and to the monarchy itself. Titles are not forever, loyalty matters, and even a prince can be sidelined if the king deems it necessary. But what makes this story truly electrifying is that even now, as Johnny Thompson walks the halls as the new Duke of Sussex, secrets remain hidden. Whispered deals, private communications, and palace maneuvering suggest that this elevation is only the beginning. What comes next will test loyalties, challenge perceptions, and force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths. And one thing is certain. The rise of Johnny Thompson has set the stage for a conflict, a drama, and a revelation that nobody saw coming. The question now is not just who Johnny Thompson is, it's what he will do with the power, the title, and the influence that has been handed to him. And what comes next for Harry, a man who has been erased from the institution he once served, remains a suspenseful, uncharted, and deeply emotional journey. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Behind the grand facade of Buckingham Palace, behind the ceremonial pomp and the flashing cameras, history was quietly being rewritten. A single meeting, convened in one of the palace's most secure and private chambers, would set in motion events that no one outside those walls could have imagined. This was not a casual gathering. There were no aides taking notes for public release, no cameras to record the solemn proceedings, no leaks expected, only the most trusted figures in the monarchy, convened by King Charles himself, ready to make a decision that would reverberate across the royal family and the world. The subject of this meeting? The future of the Duke of Sussex title and, by extension, the fate of Prince Harry. The tension in the room was palpable. Imagine a chamber filled with whispers, the faint rustle of papers, the subtle shifting of chairs, and the almost imperceptible weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on everyone present. Every gesture mattered. Every word was measured. For decades, the monarchy had relied on discretion, protocol, and the careful management of perception. And now, in this room, the very core of the family's future was being debated. At the center was King Charles, seated at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady, yet intense. Advisors leaned in, offering counsel, presenting data, recounting rumors, and outlining potential outcomes. And somewhere in the background, Johnny Thompson, quiet yet present, absorbed every detail, fully aware of the gravity of the moment. What makes this meeting extraordinary is not just the decisions made, but the meticulous orchestration that led to it. Sources reveal that this session was months in the making. Advisors had compiled exhaustive reports on Harry's recent behavior, interviews he had given, charitable initiatives that had deviated from traditional protocol, his growing media presence in the United States, and his increasing independence from the monarchy's direction. Every angle was analyzed, legal ramifications, public relations consequences, and even psychological implications. The palace was treating this like a chess game, each move calculated to secure the desired outcome. The elevation of Johnny Thompson and the removal of Harry from the equation. The discussion itself was intense, with debates breaking out over loyalty, legacy, and optics. Some advisors cautioned against moving too quickly, arguing that Harry's popularity and public support made him untouchable in the court of public opinion. Others emphasized the necessity of decisive action, warning that hesitation could embolden Harry, or worse, allow him to seize control of the narrative himself. The king listened patiently, weighing each argument, considering the long-term consequences not only for the monarchy, but for the legacy of his own reign. This was strategic thinking at its highest level, a reminder that in the palace, nothing is ever casual, and every decision carries historical weight. One of the most striking moments of the meeting, according to insiders, came when the subject of Johnny Thompson was introduced. It was not presented casually. The advisors highlighted his strengths, his loyalty, and his ability to manage the responsibilities of the Duke of Sussex title without controversy. Every potential risk was addressed: his lack of public recognition, his relatively unknown background, and his need to quickly adapt to the role. But the advantages far outweighed the risks. He was reliable, discreet, and crucially, fully aligned with King Charles's vision for the monarchy. When the proposal was finally made to elevate Johnny to the title, The room paused, recognizing the audacity and historic significance of such a move. But then, inevitably, the conversation shifted to Harry. The room became tense, almost electric. How would the king explain this to his own son? How would he manage the inevitable fallout, both within the family and in the court of public opinion? Advisors debated potential messaging strategies, carefully considering every scenario. One insider described the atmosphere as a mix of reverence, anxiety, and cold calculation, a reminder that in the palace, emotions are often subdued beneath layers of protocol and strategy. Even as they discussed Harry, everyone understood the stakes. This was not merely about titles, but about influence, power, and legacy. As the meeting progressed, King Charles revealed a detail that would have shocked anyone outside the palace. He had already begun to plan the public announcement, timing it to minimize disruption and maximize impact. Every word, every photograph, every official release had been pre-approved, with contingencies for social media reaction, press coverage, and public scrutiny. This was strategy at a level few could comprehend. The king, advisors, and Johnny Thompson were orchestrating not just a title transfer, but a narrative that would define the monarchy for years to come. Yet, despite the meticulous planning, one critical variable remained: Harry himself. Sources indicate that there was debate within the room about whether to alert him in advance, to prepare him for the inevitable, or to allow the announcement to hit publicly without warning. Opinions were divided. Some argued that forewarning Harry might give him time to mobilize public opinion, issue statements, or take legal action. Others believed that secrecy was essential, that the shock would be necessary to ensure compliance and prevent any resistance. In the end, the decision was clear: Harry would be blindsided. The king, with his advisors' counsel, concluded that the element of surprise was the most effective tool in this delicate operation. Another layer of intrigue involved the subtle coordination of palace staff. Those in the know had to manage information flow carefully, ensuring that only trusted aides were aware of the plan, while preventing leaks to the press or inadvertent disclosures to other family members. One insider described it as a surgical operation in secrecy, with multiple redundancies and protocols designed to maintain absolute control. Every detail mattered, from the timing of meetings to the wording of announcements, to the alignment of all communications channels. And at the center of this was Johnny Thompson, fully briefed and prepared to step into a role that would catapult him into the royal spotlight. The emotional stakes for King Charles were also significant. Sources suggest that he struggled privately with the decision, balancing the demands of monarchy against the bonds of family. Removing a title from a son is no small act. It is unprecedented in modern history, fraught with potential scandal, and guaranteed to attract global attention. Yet Charles, steeped in decades of preparation and keenly aware of the importance of legacy, concluded that this step was necessary to secure the monarchy's future. It was not personal in the conventional sense, it was strategic. And in a palace where perception is everything, the king's resolve had to be absolute. As the meeting drew to a close, the final steps were outlined. Advisors would prepare briefing materials, messaging would be coordinated with media partners, and every contingency would be mapped. Johnny Thompson would begin receiving instructions and guidance on his new role, ensuring that he was ready to assume the title seamlessly. And Harry, entirely unaware of the storm about to hit, would soon be confronted with a reality he could not have anticipated. The stakes could not have been higher, and the impact would be felt across the monarchy, the media, and the public consciousness. But perhaps the most chilling element of this meeting, according to insiders, was the quiet acknowledgement that once the decision was made, there would be no turning back. The path had been chosen, the game had been set, and the consequences, for Harry, for Johnny, for the family, and for the monarchy, would unfold in ways that nobody could have predicted. And just when it seemed the meeting could not carry more weight, a final revelation emerged. One advisor, a figure who had long served in secretive roles, pointed out a potential complication. Harry had allies outside the palace, individuals with media access, legal influence, and public platforms that could challenge the plan. For a moment, the room tensed. How could the monarchy ensure that the announcement would proceed without interference? How could they control the narrative when one rogue prince had the power to disrupt everything? The answer, as history would soon reveal, involved a combination of timing, secrecy, and psychological strategy, ensuring that Harry would be blindsided, leaving him powerless to react until the title had already been irrevocably transferred. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When most people hear Duke of Sussex, they think simply of Prince Harry, the charismatic, beloved, and sometimes controversial royal who carried the title with a mixture of charm, duty, and personal passion. But to fully grasp the gravity of King Charles's decision to hand this title to Johnny Thompson, you have to understand what the Duke of Sussex really represents: a legacy, a responsibility, and a symbol of power that stretches far beyond mere ceremony. Titles in the British monarchy are not just names on a document. They are historical markers, social leverage, and instruments of influence. And in this case, the Duke of Sussex title carries weight that has far-reaching implications, both for Harry and for Johnny Thompson. The origins of the Duke of Sussex title date back to 1801, when it was first created for Prince Augustus Frederick, the sixth son of King George III. From its earliest days, the title has been associated with responsibility, privilege, and often the burden of balancing public expectation with personal desires. The holder of this title is not merely a figurehead. They are expected to engage in charitable work, represent the monarchy abroad, and uphold a legacy of decorum and duty. When Prince Harry was granted the title upon his marriage in 2018, it symbolized more than familial affection. It marked him as a trusted and permanent figure in the royal hierarchy, someone entrusted to carry forward both public duties and the personal legacy of his late mother, Princess Diana. But what makes the Duke of Sussex title so significant is not just its ceremonial prestige. It is the balance of influence it provides within the royal family. Unlike other titles, which may be largely symbolic, the Duke of Sussex historically holds a unique position within the hierarchy of succession and public visibility. The title conveys not only rank but also a measure of autonomy, the ability to engage in international work, and, importantly, the freedom to shape one's own public narrative. In essence, it is a key to both visibility and power within the institution, a key Harry had wielded with remarkable skill, particularly in humanitarian work, military advocacy, and media engagement. For the monarchy, the Duke of Sussex title is also a strategic tool. It represents a point of connection between the public and the crown, a way to project influence without destabilizing the formal line of succession. Historically, dukes have been tasked with both ceremonial and practical responsibilities, attending state functions, leading charitable initiatives, representing the UK abroad, and serving as visible examples of royal values. When a duke steps out of line, as Harry increasingly did, it creates a dilemma for the institution. How do you balance public admiration with the necessity of control? How do you manage perception when one individual becomes a lightning rod for global attention? King Charles's decision to elevate Johnny Thompson to this title was designed to answer precisely these questions. But there is also a deeply emotional and symbolic layer to this title. For Harry, the Duke of Sussex was inseparable from his connection to his mother. Princess Diana's humanitarian legacy, her global influence, and her untimely death imbued the title with personal resonance. To be stripped of it is not merely a bureaucratic change. It is a symbolic severing of lineage, identity, and emotional inheritance. And to have it pass to someone entirely outside the family? That is a profound statement about loyalty, control, and the limits of familial ties in the monarchy. Johnny Thompson, on the other hand, inherits this legacy without the historical baggage, emotional attachment, or public scrutiny that had defined Harry's tenure as Duke. To outsiders, he represents stability, discretion, and a blank slate on which the monarchy can project its preferred narrative. He does not carry the same public persona, the same history of military service, or the same philanthropic identity that Harry had cultivated. But in the eyes of King Charles and his advisors, this is precisely the advantage. Johnny can embody the role without introducing complications, controversy, or unpredictability. He is, in essence, the perfect executor of the monarchy's will, unencumbered by legacy, yet fully empowered by title. And yet, the decision was not without risk. Historically, transferring a title so closely associated with a living, visible member of the family is almost unprecedented. There are legal and constitutional nuances to consider, historical precedents to navigate, and the potential for public backlash to manage. For Charles, this required careful planning, reviewing letters patent, consulting legal advisors, and ensuring that every aspect of the transfer was airtight. The palace had to account not only for the mechanics of the title's reassignment, but also for the optics, the way the world would perceive Harry's erasure and Johnny's elevation. Every detail mattered, from the timing of the announcement to the framing in official statements and the preparation of supporting advisors. In addition, the title carries substantial responsibility. Beyond ceremonial duties, the Duke of Sussex is expected to oversee charitable foundations, engage with military organizations, and participate in official state functions. Johnny Thompson, as insiders reveal, underwent extensive briefings and training to prepare him for these responsibilities. Unlike Harry, who had grown into the role organically over years, Johnny had to assimilate the expectations of the monarchy rapidly, learning protocols, ceremonial procedures, and public engagement strategies almost overnight. Observers describe his preparation as intensive, thorough, and deliberately designed to ensure a seamless transition that would leave the public with no doubt about his legitimacy and capability. The emotional complexity of this moment cannot be overstated. For Harry, the transfer of the Duke of Sussex title is a public and personal rebuke, signaling that he is no longer trusted, no longer central to the family strategy, and no longer considered a steward of its legacy. For Johnny, it is both an honor and a tremendous responsibility, thrusting him into a position where every action, every word, and every appearance will be scrutinized in comparison to the man he has replaced. The contrast between the two men is stark. One a global celebrity with decades of public engagement, the other a meticulously groomed newcomer, elevated strategically, yet burdened with expectations that could make or break his credibility in the eyes of the world. And then there is the public perception. A title like Duke of Sussex carries enormous visibility. Fans, media outlets, and royal enthusiasts are quick to analyze, judge, and comment. When the world learned that Johnny Thompson had inherited this title, reactions ranged from disbelief to admiration to outright outrage. Harry's supporters saw it as an egregious act of betrayal. Royal historians analyzed the move as unprecedented. Social media exploded with speculation, memes, and heated debate. Every angle of this story was dissected, every consequence anticipated. The palace had prepared for some of this, but no amount of planning could fully anticipate the emotional and social reverberations that followed. But perhaps the most critical aspect of this transfer is the message it sends within the royal family itself. Titles are not merely decorative. They are symbols of trust, loyalty, and proximity to the crown. By giving the Duke of Sussex title to Johnny Thompson, King Charles sent a clear signal. Loyalty, discretion, and alignment with the monarchy's vision are more important than birthright or public adoration. It is a lesson in power, a demonstration of authority, and a statement that no one, not even a beloved son, is immune to the consequences of divergence from the crown's expectations. And yet, as we have seen throughout this story, titles are never just about rules and traditions. They are deeply human, laden with emotion, pride, and personal stakes. For Harry, the loss is a wound that cuts to the heart of identity. For Johnny, the elevation is a challenge, a test of character, and an opportunity to define himself in the shadow of a predecessor whose fame and legacy are unmatched. The tension between these two forces, the erased prince and the elevated newcomer, is what makes this moment so unprecedented, so captivating, and so consequential for the monarchy, for the public, and for the history of the title itself. As we move forward, the next chapter will reveal the private fallout, Harry's reaction, his allies' attempts to intervene, and the carefully orchestrated public announcement that would leave the world, and Harry, reeling. Every title has its history, every elevation its consequences, and every decision its ripple effects. The Duke of Sussex title, once synonymous with Harry, now belongs to Johnny Thompson, and the story of this transfer is only beginning to unfold. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. In the quiet hours of the night, when the cameras were off, the palace lights dimmed, and the public's gaze was elsewhere, Prince Harry confronted a reality he could hardly believe. The title he had carried with pride, the identity he had built around his role as the Duke of Sussex, and the legacy that connected him to his late mother, Princess Diana, were no longer his. Johnny Thompson had officially inherited the title, and Harry was, in effect, erased from a role that had defined much of his adult life. The fall was both sudden and meticulously orchestrated, leaving him not only shocked but emotionally shattered. Imagine a man of Harry's stature, military veteran, global philanthropist, internationally celebrated figure, suddenly stripped of the symbolic authority that had anchored his public life. Friends describe him as initially numb, walking the corridors of his private residence with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. The weight of betrayal pressed down, not just from the act itself, but from the realization that it had been carefully planned, deliberated, and executed behind closed doors, away from his knowledge or input. The palace, the advisors, and even members of his own family had aligned to remove him from the narrative, a narrative he had helped shape for decades. Harry's desperation manifested in several ways. Insiders recount long, private phone calls with trusted confidants, calls that stretched into the early hours, where he tried to make sense of what had happened. "Why would my father do this?" he asked repeatedly, his voice tinged with hurt and incredulity. These weren't merely rhetorical questions. They reflected a profound disorientation, a sense of betrayal that cut across the boundaries of family, duty, and personal identity. It was as if the foundations of his world had shifted overnight, leaving him floating in uncertainty. One of the first emotional spikes came from a particularly private conversation with a close aide. Harry reportedly paced for hours, grappling with the realization that Johnny Thompson, a figure he barely knew, was now wearing the title, attending the events, and assuming the responsibilities that had once been his. The aide recalled Harry's mixture of anger and despair. He couldn't believe it. He felt blindsided, powerless, and above all, he felt a profound sense of isolation, as if the monarchy itself had turned its back on him. In a world where perception is everything, Harry was suddenly removed from the frame, replaced by someone who could act as a stand-in for his identity, responsibilities, and public presence. And yet, desperation was not the only emotion Harry experienced. There was also a flicker of anger, sharp and intense. Sources describe moments of private confrontation with aides, where Harry questioned not just the decision but the loyalty of those around him. Why hadn't he been warned? Why hadn't he been consulted? Why, after years of service, philanthropy, and public engagement, was he being erased so completely? These questions, voiced in private and in frustration, reflected a profound sense of betrayal. It wasn't just a title that was taken, it was trust, respect, and a central place within the family hierarchy. This private anguish also intersected with fear. Harry knew the public would soon learn of Johnny Thompson's elevation. The media, social commentators, and royal fans would speculate, dissect, and criticize. How would the world interpret his removal? Would they see him as a failure, a rebel, or a man who had been unfairly sidelined? The anticipation of public scrutiny compounded the personal hurt, creating a tense, almost unbearable psychological pressure. Friends describe Harry as walking on glass, careful with every public statement, every social media interaction, and every engagement, knowing that any misstep could reinforce the narrative of his decline. In addition to the emotional turmoil, Harry faced practical challenges. His charitable initiatives, international engagements, and public commitments were suddenly destabilized. Some of his projects, previously aligned with his official title and influence, required renegotiation, rebranding, or even withdrawal. The ripple effect was immediate. Teams were unsure who to report to, partner organizations hesitated, and public events had to be adjusted. The transition, though strategically managed by the palace, created chaos in Harry's world, further amplifying his sense of loss and desperation. Perhaps the most painful aspect of Harry's private struggle was the feeling of betrayal from his own family. King Charles, once his father and supporter, had orchestrated this decision. Other members of the royal household, trusted advisors, and even distant relatives had participated in, or at least acquiesced to, a plan that effectively erased him. For Harry, the personal and institutional betrayal were inseparable. Friends note that he spent nights replaying conversations, analyzing interactions, and trying to identify signs he had missed, moments when he could have acted differently, moments when he might have influenced the outcome, now gone forever. But desperation is rarely passive. Despite the emotional weight, Harry took steps to assert some form of control. Sources indicate that he reached out to key allies outside the palace, including legal advisors, media consultants, and international contacts who had supported him during previous controversies. He sought advice, explored options for challenging the transfer, and even considered public statements to frame the narrative on his terms. These actions, while restrained, reflect a strategic mind at work even amid emotional turmoil, a man determined not to be silenced, even as the system worked against him. Harry's private desperation was also marked by reflection. He began questioning his own choices over the years, stepping back from royal duties, engaging with international media, and pursuing independent projects. Was this moment the inevitable consequence of his decisions? Could he have navigated the system differently, maintained loyalty, and preserved his place? These questions haunted him, creating a mixture of regret, frustration, and determination. And yet, in the quietest moments, a deeper concern emerged. What would this mean for his family, particularly his children? The removal of his title was not just a personal loss. It symbolically diminished the heritage and public identity that he hoped to pass on. Insiders also highlight the psychological toll. Harry reportedly experienced sleepless nights, periods of intense anxiety, and moments of emotional withdrawal. Friends recount that he sometimes appeared distracted, withdrawn, or lost in thought, reflecting the weight of the situation. This wasn't mere dramatization. It was a profound, human response to a highly unusual and deeply personal crisis. A prince, raised with a sense of purpose and duty, suddenly stripped of authority, trust, and recognition, grappling with both the public and private consequences, is a man confronting a unique and devastating dilemma. Amid this turmoil, Harry's inner circle worked tirelessly to provide support. Confidants described late-night strategy sessions, emergency phone calls, and quiet reassurances intended to help him navigate the unfolding chaos. They offered both practical advice and emotional support, attempting to balance public-facing strategy with the deeply personal pain he was experiencing. These allies played a crucial role in helping him maintain perspective, manage appearances, and prepare for the inevitable media scrutiny. And yet, even with support, Harry's private desperation had no immediate resolution. Every plan to respond, every message considered, was constrained by the reality of palace control. The monarchy had engineered a situation where the transfer of the Duke of Sussex title was irreversible, and public reaction could not be easily predicted or controlled. Harry was, in effect, trapped between personal anguish and institutional authority, forced to reconcile private grief with the relentless scrutiny of a global audience. Perhaps most tellingly, insiders report that Harry spent hours reflecting on what loyalty, family, and duty truly meant in this context. He had been a loyal son, a committed public servant, and a dedicated father and husband. Yet loyalty alone had not protected him. The experience forced him to confront a harsh truth. Within the monarchy, personal bonds are often secondary to strategy, optics, and legacy. It was a revelation that would shape not only his response to this moment, but also his approach to family, public life, and personal identity in the years to come. And as Harry wrestled with these emotions, shock, anger, fear, and reflection, one thought dominated his mind. How would he respond next? Could he fight back? Should he fight back? Or was the most strategic move to retreat, regroup, and consider his next steps quietly, away from the glare of the public eye? Every option carried risk, every decision had consequences, and the clock was ticking. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. While Harry grappled with disbelief, anger, and heartbreak, Johnny Thompson was quietly preparing for the moment that would define his life. Unlike the high-profile trajectory of a royal by birth, Johnny's ascent was subtle, strategic, and calculated, a masterclass in patience, discretion, and timing. To outsiders, his sudden appearance as the new Duke of Sussex may have seemed abrupt, almost miraculous. But behind closed palace doors, his rise had been orchestrated over months, if not years, a careful accumulation of trust, influence, and opportunity. Johnny's path to prominence began far from the limelight. Sources describe him as a man of quiet ambition, deeply observant, and extremely disciplined. He understood the intricate web of palace politics, the balance of power, and the ways in which loyalty and discretion were valued above flamboyance or self-promotion. While Harry's public engagements were visible, media-driven, and often unpredictable, Johnny operated in the shadows, building relationships, completing critical assignments, and gaining favor with advisors who mattered most. He was, in essence, the ideal candidate for elevation, competent, reliable, and uncontroversial. His early years within the orbit of the monarchy reveal a pattern of meticulous strategy. Insider accounts suggest Johnny began as a consultant and aide on charitable initiatives, quietly demonstrating his skill in diplomacy, logistics, and problem-solving.